In the case of the beacon, 70% or so of our community is based on Asia.
Yeah, how do you go about marketing to these
There's
people?
way more people in the industry than what you believe. It's like Twitter is just like a 20% of it. There's another 80% of communities that don't use Twitter.
What would you say are the top 3 lessons that you've learned?
Well, recently where everybody was saying that NFTs are dead and stuff like that, right? And in the end, if you produce a good product, especially a game, people will not really think about the market and they will want to participate and play.
Have you noticed differences and similarities in the buyer psychology from Asia? When you made that announcement and you saw the reaction from the community, how did you and the team react to that? What was the reaction internally? Clearly, before the incredible successful sellout, which was over $3 million in NFT raised, there was a big outrage regarding the mint supply and the mint price. When you made that announcement and you saw the reaction from the community, how did you and the team react to that? What was the reaction internally?
So there was a bit, but I wouldn't say that it was the biggest part of it, but there was a bit of self-doubt when that happened because, okay, so some of the community was outraged, but I'd say that the part that was the most unsettling or the most disappointing, I would say, were the supposed experts and KOLs and people that know about the industry that criticized us without even knowing what the project was about. Like plenty of our critics said, like, "Oh, this is outrageous. This is impossible," and some of them didn't even like follow us on Twitter. So if you're gonna criticize a project, it's you better do your due diligence before you criticize it, unless you want to risk making a mistake publicly, like most of these people made. I'd say that was the most disappointing part. But internally, as a team, even though of course the backlash was a bit unsettling, we knew that we were going to make it. We knew that
Uh-huh.
we were going to be able to mint this collection because um, we were receiving tons and tons of requests for whitelist, tons of requests for collaborations. And in the end of the day, we realized that even though it was a 10K NFT collection, we didn't have enough to fulfill all the people that was trying to get a whitelist, right? In the case of the beacon, 70% or so of our community is based on Asia. And you're not going to be able to see that on Twitter because most of Asia does not use Twitter. They barely even use Discord for that matter. So most of our community wasn't reflected on Twitter and to these people, and that's why they thought we were crazy. But internally, we knew we were not. We knew the traction we had. So I'd say it was unsettling in a way because most of these people say that they push for the adoption of Web3 and to grow as an industry, but none of them hesitated even a bit to attack us without doing even the slightest amount of research just to get some traction and attention for their socials. And I think I'd say that was the lack of camaraderie of the space that was a bit unsettling. But even though there was a backlash, we knew that we would make it. For every person that complained, there were 10 other people trying to reach out to get a whitelist.
Absolutely. And I saw this tweet, which I think is pretty representative of the situation. It was the beacon didn't launch in June 2024. It's been in building since 2022, early 2022, when you had the big treasure launch. So this has been a over 2 years process now of getting to the point where you are today.
Right. We didn't come out of the blue and just decided this. It's like we had a engaged and supporting community beforehand. This was the second collection that we minted. The first one was also very successful by the standards of the industry
Yes.
at that point. So we sort of knew what we were doing. And some people treated us like we just came out of the blue. And no, dude, we've been building on the open for at least a year and a half.
And you mentioned something that I latched on, which is applying the things that you've learned from the lessons over the last couple of months. What would you say are the top 3 lessons that you've learned in the
Hmm.
last chapter of the beacon that you wish you knew earlier?
Hmm. It's a good question. So I'd say the first one is prepare yourself better to more inflow than you possibly deemed imaginable that you would have. Like when we created the New Frontiers Quest Phase 1, which was the latest event, we of course expected traction, but we got about 3 times the traction that we
Mm.
anticipated, and that took a toll on us because I'd say we weren't precisely prepared enough in terms of customer support, in terms of all the channels that you needed to manage and all the collaborations that appeared and everything. So maybe having a more resilient structure for potential success would have been very helpful for all of us. The second is that I guess we knew this, and that's why we did this activity in the way that we produced it. Is that a product is always going to come first in terms, at least in Web3 gaming, the product is always going to be more important than the market sentiment. People tend to correlate market sentiment and think that if the market is in a bad state, then no matter what product you have, it's not gonna do well, right? But I'd say that that's wrong, and I say that well from our position because we've launched 2 times in very dire market conditions. The first one was pretty much 2 weeks after the FTX crash, so the worst sentiment
Yes.
ever that I've ever seen, and
Hmm.
the second one was, well, recently where everybody was saying that NFTs are dead and stuff like that, right? And in the end, if you produce a good product, especially a game, people will not really think about the market and they will want to participate and play and potentially purchase something within it as they do with normal games. The Web3 side becomes like an additional benefit rather than the whole motif of existence of the product.
Yes.
Because when people just like the game and get immersed within it, they forget about the market conditions. So that's the other one. And the third one is, and this is like an advice, I learned this on the first launch and in the second launch, and it's that you do not fade entire regions like Asia or growing regions like South America that are really starting to become very prominent in the space. And you don't use Twitter as the only source of truth in the space because it's just not. You got to be a bit more humble and just
Interesting.
realize that there's tons of regions that use channels like Telegram or other channels that you're not even familiar with. Like in Japan, they use Line and stuff like that. And you need to understand these communities and really try to connect with them through their channels rather than forcing them into yours. And if you do that, you're likely gonna find that there's way more people in the industry than what you believe. It's like Twitter is just like a 20% of it. There's another 80% of communities that don't use Twitter and growing communities like in South America, like in Brazil, Argentina, and those countries. And they're going to become increasingly relevant. So you aim for those and you try to connect with those people and you don't use only the US as a hallmark of adoption because it isn't. So I mean, it's a good hallmark. It's a good region for sure, but it's not by any means not the only one. So it's like those 3 things. There's of course more to it, but most of the learnings are internal in terms of having better planning, better ways to mitigate potential backlash, a better way of doing announcements, better way of communicating things. Like there's a ton of learnings. Can you still hear me well,
This is
man,
very
or is my
interesting.
connection just
I,
died?
I can hear you perfectly. No, this is very interesting what you say. The 20% is actually on Twitter and the rest is outside. First time I hear this, and even myself as a marketer, I would have assumed that most of my target audience is on Twitter.
Well, I might be exaggerating a bit, but I can like so our top 3 communities right now, and let's say that the US had 300,000 users, unique users, let's say from the US, and that was like our fourth biggest community. Um, Vietnam, China, and Singapore, like those three, and it's hard to distinguish what of the Singapore-ish side is VPNs from China. Those three add up to 1.6 million or so. So they're like five
Wow.
times larger than the US, and most of those people don't use Twitter. They use either Telegram or WeChat or other channels. So what,
So,
internally, for
so
instance,
how do you go
we knew.
about
Tell
networking?
me.
Yeah, how do you go
It's
about
a
marketing
very
to these people
it's
that
very
are?
challenging. So the way that we did it was at first I traveled plenty through Hong Kong and South Korea and Singapore, trying to establish connections over there. And there we found partners that act as bridges in a way between these communities and you, and let's say Western products, Western projects. Um, it's very hard to reach a Chinese community if you don't speak Chinese and you don't understand the culture or the channels, right? But if you have a partner that sort of helps you target these people, that helps. And every Asian country is different. Japan is very different in terms of marketing and onboarding than South Korea, and South Korea is very different from Singapore and so on, right? But it was planning to really try to get my feet in the ground and try to understand how things work over there. But I also need to add that a good portion of the traction that we got in Asia, particularly, was organic. It happened on its own accord. Like this, things started to get alive on their own, and they started to spread across Telegram and their channels, and they came alive like that. And then plenty of people from these different regions, especially like the most vocal ones, came into our Discord and said and asked us like, "Hey, I got a community. Can you guys like give me some whitelist spots, or can you have more information for my community?" There's plenty of people that reach to you, and that then they have a community that they translate the information over to. So I'd say that that's some of the ways, but it's challenging. It's very hard as a Westerner if you don't handle the language or the culture to penetrate those regions. But it's possible,
Uh-huh.
especially with the right partners.
Have you noticed a difference in buyer behavior? In the West, Western consumers tend to have more, especially in Web3, of a investor mindset. They buy into the
Mhm.
product because they see it performing well long term as an asset. Have you
Mhm.
noticed differences and similarities in the buyer psychology
Yes,
from Asia?
yes. For because Asia is very different, and what I'm gonna say is like just like vast generalizations, right? But for instance, Japan and South Korea tend to be like way more product oriented. They like buying things and just for the sake of having collectible stuff on the internet. They of course expect some returns or whatever, but it seems to be secondary. They're not that vocal about the financial side. While a good portion of China is very interested on the financial side of it, but they're also quite interested on the product. Most of Asia is really into gacha mechanics and stuff like that. So there's a difference, I'd say. But a good portion of Asia, and maybe this is because there's a lack of communication, maybe they seem to be more product centric. But I'd say that we may see that reflected on the Web 2 side. Like Asia is very big into mobile gaming. For instance, South Korea, I think it has like the biggest spending per user in terms of gaming. It's like 10 times what most regions are. So there's a difference in culture for sure. It's hard to grasp it though. But and every country is different. Like we tend to think that Asia is like all similar. It's like no, Japan is very different from South Korea, and in terms of their behavior.
Interesting. Interesting. Diego, how far do you see when it comes to the state of Web3 gaming? How far are we from having products that are for the masses, so mass consumer products?
I'd say that we are currently in the first iteration of potential viable projects, although most of them are not ready yet, and most of them won't be ready for the next probably year or so. But we're finally starting to see viable games that can really attract normal gamers, so to say, or gamers that don't know anything about Web3. Most of the games that I'm seeing, maybe the Beacon included in this, are on their first iterations of actual viable products, alpha of sorts, or whatever you want to call them. But we're starting to really see the first wave of actual games. I'd say that the industry has learned from the past in terms of gamify or Web3 gaming 2 years ago was mostly not actual games, but like gamified excuses to use the blockchain or something like that, and most of them proved to be unsustainable, unreliable, and most of them collapsed for that matter. And I'd say that the industry and most projects have learned from the previous mistakes and created actual games with substance and capacity of retention on their own, and then adding comprehensible Web3 mechanics within them so that there's an actual benefit from using Web3 instead of Web3 being the justification for creating the game. Um, and I'd say that we're in the first iteration of that. My belief is that we're still like 1 or 2 years away from having actual really solid games that would onboard normal gamers that don't know or don't even need to know about Web3 to really try the games. But we'll get there. I don't have like any doubt that we will get to that point very soon. This year, I
Amazing.
mean,
One to
a
two
year from now
years,
or
which
two.
is
Yeah, that's my belief.
yeah, 1 to 2 years, man. I do hope you're right. Diego, this
I
has been
mean, I
really
could be wrong.
interesting, man. A lot of interesting insight on the marketing, on the building, and the lessons that you've learned during the launch of the latest the Beacon Mint. The we've been working together on the Twitter Spaces side, assisting in the communication of the brand, the product on X specifically. I'd love to hear on your side. What would you say is something that stood out from your experience working closely with us at Unfungible?
So I'd say that you guys are creating a very interesting culture of different projects coming together and talking about important subjects in what regards to the industry, right? I think it's very valuable and it's very rare to see that. Personally, I've enjoyed and learned plenty within these spaces because you actually hear the takes and the reasoning behind the business decisions of different projects. And it's been very interesting on that end. There's also one thing that Twitter Spaces do that is very, very valuable, although we of course need to expand the reach at some point, but it's very valuable the fact that most of the initiatives that we run as projects, it's very hard to condensate them into text, into a Twitter announcement or a Discord announcement, and having people actually understand them. Most people don't really read, man. That's also one of the issues, and it's hard to explain complex mechanics in a line of 500 characters in text, right? But if you jump into a space, dude, verbally, it's way easier to transmit the ideas and the reasoning behind them and what are the implications of different things. And that's when I say that Twitter Spaces are really, really valuable because they give you an option to really explain things in a comprehensive manner and that can be reproduced anywhere and people can listen to them while they're doing other stuff instead of trying to condensate these ideas into announcements. Like we made a few mistakes with our announcements. I'd say that we could have been clearer on some sides and made things more comprehensive for people. But that would have been way easier if it was a verbal communication instead of a written communication, right? So that's also a very important benefit of having the spaces. And working with you guys as well, you guys offer a fantastic platform. You guys also offer fantastic discussions. You give space to the projects to explain their ideas and initiatives, but also to explain, or at least you give the founders or the representatives of the project the capacity of really sharing their minds, which is a rare occurrence. It's hard for community to see how a founder thinks, but within these spaces they can see it, and from multiple founders at the same time, which really gives you an overall notion of where the industry is going. And I think that's very, very valuable.
Incredible. I appreciate that, Diego. And man, I will say it has been a pleasure working with you. The team loves you, and you are a gem to be around, man. So thank you, man, for the trust that you've put in me and myself and the team.
Thank
And
you
I
guys for
look
sharing.
forward to this continued partnership.
So do I. I mean, it's been a pleasure to work with you guys. You're very professional, and that's surprisingly that's hard to find in the industry. Like an actual very professional team. That's I really value that, and you guys are really doing
I
something
love
good
that.
for the industry.
Beautiful. Thank you, Diego.
All right, Leon.